The inspiration for the book, I can track down to quite a specific date, in fact. I was in the car listening to the radio, and there was an historian who is an expert in 18th century criminality, and she was talking about the kinds of crimes that they had in the 18th century, which were very different from the crimes that we have now. For example, anglers who had almost like fishing rods. They used to sit on top of roofs and pick off wigs or valuable items from carriages, that sort of thing. There were footpads and highwaymen and link boys and plumbers. I won't tell you what all of these are, but it just really inspired me and got my imagination going. And I remember going into the back garden that afternoon and pretty much plotting the whole story so that I had something very solid to work on from day one. The process I went through in writing the novel was rather a long and convoluted one, looking back on it. It took me, I suppose, 5 years, really, of writing. That was partly because I was learning how to do it as I went along. I'd actually had training as a journalist and as a scriptwriter, but not as a novelist, even though I had spent most of my life reading novels and loving literature, but I never had any formal training in writing a novel. So it was all a bit of an experiment for me, I guess, looking back. But what I did was write the first 3 chapters about 10 times, I remember. And then I started almost straight away reading it to my children. And that was the thing which was most useful to me, because I would carefully observe the reactions of my children. And I knew when I was being boring, and I knew when I was being interesting. And if ever I got a sort of a gasp or a cry, I knew that I'd done something really good, and that's definitely going to be kept in. So it was a long and interesting process. And I was writing other things at the same time. I was doing a little bit of journalism. I was doing some script writing for radio and television as well. So it meant that because it was written over a period of years, in fact, all the ideas and characters all composted down and became very, very real to me. I think that's actually added to the book. So although it sounds like a terrible thing to spend that long working on one novel, in fact, I think it was useful for me to do, and it was very useful because it was my first novel and because it allowed me to perfect my technique. I needed to do quite a lot of research for the Gideon trilogy. The research becomes addictive. It's a very, very enjoyable thing to do. And the kinds of things I did were obviously reading historical works, sort of general historical works, so that I knew who was king and if there was a war going on and so on and so forth. But the kind of books that were most useful to me were specifically on 18th century criminality. So there's a book called Con Men and Cutpurses by Lucy Moore, who's a specialist historian of the period, which told me all about the kinds of criminals they had then. I also often used a book, I've just got it in front of me actually, called Michael Brander, The Georgian Gentleman, and that is all about the daily life in the 18th century. And there were several books that I used that gave me a good idea of social mores and how people behaved and how they thought about the world, their philosophy, ideas, and so on. I also visited historic sites. For example, I visited Sheepwash Bridge in Ashford-under-Water, which was the location where the children first realised that they're actually in the 18th century. I visited St. Paul's Cathedral and Lincoln's Inn Fields and the Sir John Soanes Museum, all sorts of fascinating historic buildings in London. And I guess finally, I've also searched through texts that were written at that time. So I've had fun sort of flicking through Boswell's Life of Johnson, say, and also Daniel Defoe's Moll Flanders, and plays by Oliver Goldsmith, to get a feel of the language. So I came at it at all sorts of fronts, really, so that I needed to have an idea of the history, I needed to have an idea of Georgian society, and I needed to have an idea, above all, of how they spoke. One of the reasons I was so enthusiastic to try and get a bit of science into the work was from having been involved with an organisation for a few years now, in England called PAWS, which stands for Public Awareness of Science. This organisation brings writers and scientists together. It's an organisation that encourages the inclusion of science in particularly drama, actually, but I've chosen to do it in fiction. And it was through listening to scientific experts on all sorts of fascinating subjects, such as nanotechnology and particle physics and all sorts of things that I'd never heard of before, that I started to think, yep, I could have a go at incorporating this into my story. The anti-gravity machine, I suppose, has pivotal importance in this book. I needed a means by which the children would be able to go back in time. And the one thing that I didn't want to do was to resort to magic. What I wanted to do was to have something that potentially could actually work. So in the same way as I talk about real historical events and real historical people, then fictionalize them to some extent, what I decided to do was to take some scientific facts such as Einstein's theory of relativity, the fact that time is relative. If you, for example, travel at the speed of light for a year, when you get back to Earth, all the people that you ever knew would be dead. So various facts about the nature of time I wanted to incorporate into the story. Now, I'm no scientist, but I came across a work called How to Build Your Own Time Machine by an Australian scientist called Paul Davies, I think. Most of the scientific theory does go straight over my head, but there is a relationship between gravity and time. And I've got whole files of material on how potentially you could build a time machine. So it's something that in the book I don't go into detail about how this machine works or how it was built, but I was very conscious that I wanted to introduce a few scientific concepts which might be of interest to children. I decided pretty early on that the story of Gideon, Peter and Kate and the Tarman was not going to fit into one volume. And I think pretty much from day one I thought to myself that this is going to be a trilogy. It's just too big to fit into one book. And it fitted quite neatly. I don't really want to talk about book 3 at the moment, but book 1 I very much saw as a book about the 18th century seen through the eyes of 21st century children, whereas a substantial part of book 2 is taking a look at the 21st century through the eyes of an 18th century person. And book 3 has rather a different emphasis, which I won't talk about now. Just in terms of the number of characters, the scale of the adventure, I always knew that it needed to be in 3 volumes.